to the candidates forum this evening. We'll start off with the select board candidates, and then we're going to move into the water commissioner, probably between 7 and 17, hopefully. If you do have any questions you'd like to write down, I have the format usually is we ask the select board or the chair of the water commission to submit questions that they would like to hear answers to. And then we also open it up to the public. So if you'd like to ask a question, I will give you questions that have been pre-submitted and then cards so that you can write down. So if you'd like either one of those, I'll take some and pass it on this side, some on here. Just questions and cards. Need more? I got to see more.
Anybody want questions or cards?
John, give me a fresh copy, please.
Casey. I didn't change any of the questions.
You kept emailing me that you had the wrong email address, so I'm wondering.
No, you got it.
I kept wondering.
It comes back to me when
It was like
So I just
back
like
and
to
forth.
actually, I'm Anna Kane, I'm the chair of the Democratic Town Committee. We are sponsoring tonight's event. And welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome everyone at home. That's okay. Do you need more? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else need? So on the front of the select board, in the back, I give the water. Yeah, I got two. That's the process. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Ray Drunowski from Holyoke and turn the show over to you.
Thank you, Janet. I've been coming here so often, I think we should move to Southampton. This is great. So welcome, everybody. Everyone was given a card, during the introduction of the candidates. You're welcome to write down a question you have for the candidates, and the volunteers will collect the questions, and then they will organize those most frequently asked questions so that we can present those to each candidate during the forum tonight. There'll be a 3-minute introduction by each candidate. Well, they will share their experiences and qualifications for the position, their vision for the board for which they wish to serve, which we're starting with Select Board, and the commitment they will bring to each office. The timekeeper in the front will raise a 30-second card to notify them, which is green, and then he will raise a time's up card, which is pink. I think that's pink. Fuchsia. And we will choose the names randomly to start. So, if you could also silence your cell phones and other devices, that would be great.
Ray, I'm sorry, I also would like to acknowledge Art Lawrence for his volunteer to timekeep tonight, so thank you.
There he is, right? He's right in the front. So we'll start with Charlie for the opening statement. 3-minute introduction.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Charlie Konecki. I'm a lifetime resident of the town of Southampton, basically third generation. I obviously have been involved in town government for the last 45 years. I've been involved in things like chairman of the Board of Health. I've been on the Aquifer Advisory Committee, Ambulance Study Group, which basically was the first program that set up the budget and the billing for our ambulance services, which is now what we use to maintain our ambulance service. Labrie Field, I was on the design committee to take and put those playing fields together and move forward with the original concepts to get this thing moving, which I'm delighted to see we're now openly trying to finish that project. I'm on the agricultural committee, which moved forward to designate our town as an agricultural community. And you've actually seen the new signs up on the streets now designating this. I'm chair of the Public Safety Building Committee. I've been doing that, I dare say, 10 to 12 years, trying to move our community forward into a public safety complex, given the condition of our police and fire station and the need to take and start moving forward on that. I've been on the Master Planning Committee for a number of years. And my goals in this town was to try to keep our town budget in check. We realized the fact that once in a while we're going to have debt exclusion votes. We also realized the fact that this is a burden to the residents to increase taxes. We need to establish a public safety complex. We need to develop some more with our senior center. My hope was to take and utilize the old town hall as a new senior cultural center down the road as we move forward with that. And maybe utilize the old fire station for the public water department so they have an actual primary building, because right now they're storing stuff at the highway garage and haphazardly stuff down on Pequot Road, so on and so forth, but that department's evolving too. All in all, I have dedicated myself to try to make Southampton better. You've seen such things as the automated doors on this building, the handrails outside for the elderly. You see me work with the master planning to take and get funding to redo our streets and stuff. You see me lobby for the East Street Bridge to secure a grant for $1 million. And I'm presently working, trying to get a federal grant for the water department for about $700,000 to raise the water line out of Route 10 by the old tin shop, because that needs to happen. So I try to get outside money for the town. That's about it.
Thanks very much, Charlie. We're going to move over to Chris for her opening statement.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody, and everybody watching at home. As I mentioned to somebody, I'm hoping you're not going to have the opportunity to call in questions. But anyway, Chris Fowles, a longtime resident of Southampton as well. Grew up here, went to school in this building, and graduated from Norris School when it was only 10 years old. So that's been a while. My family was a farming family here on Gun Road, and still am living in that old house. When I left Southampton, I went to Wisconsin and majored in French, actually. I went to an agricultural state, but I ended up majoring in French, and that led me to a whole different career of working overseas. So most of my work has been international work and international development. I've worked in a number of countries, starting out, first of all, with Peace Corps. I was a teacher in French-speaking countries, and basically was a teacher of English as a foreign language in a secondary school in West Africa for 3 years. And then stayed on and managed programs for Peace Corps in both the Congo and Burundi for another 6 years. Upon finishing that, I came back to the States and then decided to continue still with my Africa work, and was able to find a job with the African Development Foundation based in Washington, D.C. And that is a grant-making organization that provides grants to community groups in Africa, as usual. And it's working especially with agriculture cooperatives, women's groups, youth groups, to look at the kinds of development they have determined that they need for their village or their community. As you can imagine, with the multitude of issues and problems we have in a town like Southampton, they're multiplied many times over in a small village in Africa. I've had the opportunity to work in some 30 different countries in Africa over my career, in some of the most marginalized and underserved communities that really sometimes depended on our grant for very survival, to put in a well in the community, for example, so they could have clean drinking water rather than having to dig out water around the roots of an old dead tree and hope that they could get something there for washing their dishes or even drinking water. Most of my work has been involved with a participatory development approach. I do not believe that people from the outside have all the answers and come in with preconceived notions and think that they know what somebody needs or what the best result is for any kind of community, including Southampton. As a result, my work was working to facilitate community dialogue, meeting with a lot of communities and helping them understand how to get to the real root problem of what they were trying to solve. There's ways to go ahead and throw money at problems but not really solve them. My vision for the board here is to be able to work in a collaborative fashion to try and coordinate activities and improve efficiencies, perhaps across boards, and certainly to have better communication out to the residents of Southampton so that they know what's going on within their own town government.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. So we're going to have the previously submitted questions to the candidates. The first question we're going to go in reverse order. Yes.
And I'm going to just collect the questions if you've completed the questions that you've written. If you haven't, I can also collect them again at the end.
Thank you. So if you have questions, you can submit those. So the first question will go to Chris. The question is, there never seems to be enough money to fund all the infrastructure, schools, departmental needs, et cetera, in town. What are 2 to 3 areas of either funding or cuts that you feel should be considered to address the problem?
Okay, thank you. I think this is a challenge that's not unique to Southampton. It obviously applies to most all of the communities in our school district, that they're facing a shortage of funds because the state is not living up to its commitment to adequately fund our rural schools, for example. And in conversations with townspeople, it doesn't take long for the subject of taxes to come up here in town. And even though we've had our override last year, it still has been a challenge for us to balance our budget this year. I guess I still wonder why we struggle with our town budget. And are there ways to better coordinate our activities across departments to minimize duplication and to maximize efficiencies? And I think there probably are. Our Public Works Department and that of the Police and Fire Department are certainly some of the most important services that we have here in town and affect the well-being of all of our residents. Undoubtedly, it's a challenge to satisfy their needs when they have huge items to purchase. I do think strides are being made to help them better plan for their fleet replacement, since that is the largest cost that they probably have. We are seeing at least some ideas for a staggered replacement schedule that would be based on the age and the mileage of such vehicles, so that it's not a surprise when it comes before the town that we have to purchase a $250,000 truck. I think there are ways that we could maybe stretch those funds a little bit better. Sometimes if somebody has maintained their vehicle very well, and it might be a vehicle that is costly, that if it could get another year of use, then maybe they could forego that purchase in that department and allow another department to take up a purchase for something that's really crucial for them. I was really encouraged at the last town meeting we had when the police chief was able to show some economies in his own budget and give that back to the town to use for the school, which I think was really a good sign of collaboration, working for the entire good of the town and not only for one department. I think the way that the departments are structured in town, and so many offices and so many committees and boards, there's a lot of fragmentation, shall we say, and maybe not a lot of good communication across divisions. And I think that we don't need to necessarily micromanage any of these departments, but I think there are ways to hold people accountable for really using our tax dollars wisely. And for me, this would ensure things like ensuring open bidding processes, being sure that we're getting the best value for our dollar. And certainly when old vehicles go away, they need to be auctioned off and money come back to town for a reserve fund to purchase something in the future. I think the biggest thing for me was the school budget, looking at Norris and how much we had to kind of nickel and dime one night to try and get them to what they needed for resources. And I think that's unfortunate, because Norris was very important to me and led me on my career. And I think we need to make the schools here whole. That is our school in town, and it's really ground zero. The kids from there go off to Hampshire Regional, they go off to Smith Voc, and we need to provide what they have for needs so they have better education on the following years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go move over to Charlie. Do you want me to read the question?
No, the question is basically there isn't enough money. I mean, there it is in a nutshell. I have been on the Capital Committee in Southampton for a number of years. That places me in a situation where I've had hands-on experience and understand what's going on with the replacement of vehicles, school budgets and buildings, and so on and so forth. As you saw at town meeting, the Capital Committee moved forward very nicely and addressed those issues as necessary. When you start looking at this as a whole, we have a $17 million budget, and then we have probably $1 million worth of capital expenses every year that we have to manage. We have to do long-term planning on this. That has begun. Our departments have put that together, and we are starting to look forward on how to budget that. You'll see that some of that budgeting is going to be internal in the budget relative to short-term borrowing. We're always going to see that dump truck for $250,000 that's going to end up as a debt exclusion, because there isn't that fast money that comes across for town meeting through just a general budget. But the reality is, I've been consciously trying to work with the committees to try to make this happen over the last few years. I think we've become very efficient in moving forward with that. I do not see any areas that we can cut services, because we're a growing community. and services are being looked at as more and more rather than less and less. So I would be very cautious to look to cut services. If we can at least keep the status quo, we're at least providing the services that are present. The other part to this is the fact that there are other linkages. I was the state district health officer, which linked me to the Commonwealth and partially to the federal government on different types of funding sources relative to what happens at a local community. Presently, Southampton has a health department that is basically half-time. Easthampton is struggling also. There presently is a bill filed to take and put funding in for a regional approach. That may be something in the next year that becomes a viable approach. There's other levels at the state government that are looking at some regional approaching and funding to get things going. These are things that need to be explored more thoroughly, but that's where we need to start looking, not trying to do everything on our own, because some of this just isn't going to work. The safety complex is another one. If we can consolidate police, fire into one building, then we are going to have savings down the road relative to that because of the fact that departments can share some of their resources to maintain level services.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Question 2, we'll go back to Chris. In what areas do you think the town needs to focus on in the next 1 to 5 years? How do you think you can contribute to these areas if elected?
Thanks. A few months ago, I was appointed as a member-at-large on the Master Plan Implementation Committee, which is newly reconstituted, and that's part of what got my interest piqued to run for the Select Board seat. The Master Plan, I think, is a foundation document that was created back in 2013 that is now being reactivated and can serve as a guideline for the future development of Southampton in terms of what we want to see for housing, for energy, for economic development. I think there are many things that have to be done, and we can always, scatter our energies and try to achieve many things and end up achieving nothing. So for me, I think I would narrow it down to maybe 1 or 2 priorities that I would like to focus on during my time on the Select Board, one of which would be affordable housing, and the second would be an economic development. Excuse me. I think oftentimes those two are presented as kind of an either-or. And I don't think that that's really true. I think there are ways to accommodate both. There's some level of development in town that's needed to keep it vibrant, to keep it relevant, but I think it must be done in a thoughtful way with the residents in mind. While there are new buildings coming in, new residents being done, new residents being built, and new families moving in, which is all encouraged, there is at the same time an aging population here in Southampton that I think we have to deal with. Some of our longer-term residents may not have family nearby, and as their own health changes or their own economic situation changes, they may find that it's not feasible to remain in the house that they used to call a home. So I think we have to take a look at what our choices are, and we have to carefully make decisions that are looking at what obstacles are there, not only for the elderly, but I might say also for first-time homeowners coming into Southampton. I think it's very hard for somebody who's never been a homeowner to come in and try to find an affordable house here in Southampton. What I would hate to see would be that seniors that have lived here most of their lives would have to end up going out of town because they can't afford to stay here in their final years. I've been lucky enough to come home to my own family house, and I truly appreciate that. But I think we need to give that a lot of attention. We need to look at perhaps adopting bylaws that look at the kinds of housing that are needed. I think there has been some attempt to do that, but our land parcels might need to be changed in terms of what we need to do for making space for our seniors. We may be constrained by some public infrastructure for economic development, but I think there are ways to look at attracting businesses into town that don't require a lot of demand on our public infrastructure. First of all, I would want to see a brief survey maybe of the townspeople. I would want to know what the people want for the businesses here in town. What is missing here in town? What do people really want? What do they really need? And I think if people are involved in the beginning for that kind of a choice, then they will be involved and committed to it once it gets developed.
Thank you. Charlie, in what areas do you think the town needs to focus on in the next 1 to 5 years, and how do you think you can contribute to these areas if elected?
If elected to the position of Select Board, the first priority would be to establish the Select Board, or have the Select Board establish what the board's priorities are. As the leaders of the community, this seems to be missing in the past year, where the Select Board should actually designate what they think the priorities are and to start moving forward. Case in point, a few years ago, we did establish things. One of the things that we looked forward was the East Street project. Not just the bridge, but the entire East Street. When you talk about infrastructure, that's a major artery in this town that's been pretty much neglected. It needs to be addressed. That is one of the areas that's a focus point. Another focus point in this town has to do with the elderly. No disrespect for the school system, but we have probably matching amount of elderly as we have students in the school. I know this because I'm the emergency manager for the town, and I have to keep the demographics available in case there's an emergency. Yet, we need to look not only at the housing for the seniors, but also linkage with the senior center. That's why I believe taking the old town hall, which is presently housing the police department, and utilizing that as a senior center would expand the area and expand the services for our seniors as time goes on. And that needs to happen. The other priority is the public safety complex that has been neglected too long. And that's the key right now. Until we move forward with a public safety complex, we can't utilize these other buildings for other programs. And the old town hall, by the way, that becomes eligible for historic money as well as community preservation money to do work on it. So my first priority would be to have the Select Board set priorities as they feel are necessary in the next few years, and to allow the board to work as a team to start moving on those priorities.
Great, thank you. The third question to Chris. The town has made recent purchases of open space land, including Labrie Field, Cook Road, Glendale Road, and now pursuing Pomeroy Meadow Road. What are your views on preserving open space?
I'm a very strong supporter of open space and conservation, land conservation efforts. I think the open fields here with or without grazing cows and horses is part of the natural charm of Southampton that is really important to the legacy of the agriculture development that was so important to our town. Some of the open lands are also critical to our natural resources, as witnessed at this last week's town meeting, and the proposed land acquisition of our proposed land acquisition to protect our drinking water recharge area up on Pomeroy Meadow. I think there's a way to take a look at promoting growth, but also having strategies to be sure that we don't neglect the open land possibilities. I think with the examples that were cited in the question, there can be the perception that we're constantly buying up open lands in town. I don't share that view. I think that deciding to preserve open space needs to be strategically analyzed to understand its value to the residents and present that to the residents to understand the worth of that investment. Sometimes there's properties that probably are not worth the investment, but we need to take the time and analyze the pros and cons of lands as they come available so that we don't end up with a white elephant that could be a burden to the town. Landowners who've put their property under Chapter 61 Forest and Agricultural regulations have benefited from a tax relief, and that provides an incentive not to develop the land. The town leaders, I think, namely the Select Board, need to regularly consult the list of landowners that have properties in Chapter and be aware that when, due to changing circumstances in that landowner's life, perhaps they are ready to make a change in the status of the ownership of that property. I think it's a responsibility of the Select Board to act in a timely fashion, follow the laws and correct process, and decide whether or not to exercise the town's right of first refusal on such property. This is a proactive strategy that I think we need to be more on top of than we have in the past. That said, decisions on land use in town, I think, have a financial impact. There's often the perception that new development brings in more revenue, but we shouldn't also forget that it brings in more expenses and demands on the town's services. A recent study, I think, that some of us saw from UMass and Amherst talked about the cost of community services as related to land use in various communities in the area. And I think it's been shown here that whatever tax dollars we're taking in for residential use That's costing the town nearly $1.30 to provide services. The open space community study showed that for open space, the dollar of tax revenue is costing only about 32 cents for town services in a town like Great Barrington, which is very similar in population to ours. My dad used to say that, the man upstairs is not making any more land, and that's really true. I believe that all of us, as residents of this community, have a duty to be the best possible stewards of our natural resources.
Thank you. So Charlie, what are your views on preserving the open space in Southampton?
This is not a new concept for the town of Southampton. My father and myself signed over 130 acres of land to be preserved in agriculture back in the late 80s. This is not something new in town. It just seems that right now it seems to be talked about an awful lot. Labrie Field was a great purchase for the town. It gave us a nice park to work on. Things are happening there. The Cook Road, I worked on that, trying to move that forward. When I was selectman, we even had to call special meetings just so that we could get signatures in time to get the grant money. And we even had to have a special meeting with the Capital Committee and the Water Department on Pequot Road just to get it under the wire so all the legal stuff was carried on. Glendale Road, the Capital Committee, and I voted in favor of that. Palmer Meadow Road, I think that's a good approach also. What are the views? Well, Southampton presently has about, I believe, 800 acres of open space land that's designated somewhere or some shape under conservation, which is impressive for a town this size. We also have over 2,000 acres that's water department property that'll always stay open space because of the reservoir that houses in town. I think we've made major strides over the years to have open space in town. I like the concept. I think it's good. I think we need to move forward with that. But we also have to understand the fact that we have to fund these things. And we have to have a maintenance program on these things. That's where I caution people to really evaluate when you buy land if this is for the betterment of the town in the long term. Yes, they're not making land anymore except in Hawaii. But other than that, I think I'm wide open with it. I think it's a good concept to keep moving forward, but we need to evaluate what parcels we need to purchase. If I was to scale things, I would consider Pomeroy Meadow Road a higher scale than I would Glendale Road, simply because of the fact that it's closer to the recharge area of the town water field. But if we have funding to do it, and the town feels we should, so be it.
Great, thank you. Our fourth question that was prepared to Chris. How will you attempt to improve Southampton's infrastructure so that we may welcome businesses that will supplement our residential real estate tax base?
Good. Well, thanks. I think as we look to the future, we have to figure out what kind of a town we want Southampton to be in 2025, 2030. Are we going to be a mini Hadley? Are we going to be an extension of Easthampton? What do we want to look like? It seems to me that the kind of infrastructure that we might need is going to depend on the businesses that want to come to town in the first place. It's limited, as we've all known, because of the public water and sewer system that's fairly non-existent, but there are many businesses that don't require that, and we can certainly pursue other kinds of opportunities. I think it's also important that we don't assume that investing in infrastructure to attract business to town will necessarily be cost effective. We're often told, I think, that we need business in town, but it's not evident to me anyway that revenues generated from potential businesses will outweigh the costs of providing services to those businesses. I think further analysis would certainly be needed to determine if that assertion is true. And then we certainly need to determine ideal locations for any kind of business coming into town to minimize any environmental impact, to look at things like stormwater runoff, et cetera. We already know that it costs more in services on residential properties than it does for our tax, than in revenues that we get from our taxes, and what would be the difference with the commercial entities. Infrastructure itself, I think, we need to take a look at some of the infrastructure that we have in town. Charlie's mentioned the old town hall and the fire department. I think those buildings, by all means, need to be looked at. They're crumbling around the fire department and the police department's ears, and we need to figure out how we can probably find the new safety complex, a good location, and then figure out what to do with those buildings. Are they worth renovating? They're historical. What would it cost? What would be the way that the town would want to be involved in that? Could we bring in some outside money? Could we find a public-private partnership to help us keep those buildings if that's what we decide we want to do? There is outside grant money out there. I'm well aware of many grants at the federal level that could be touched. We just need to do the research and do our homework to figure out where we can find some funds to help us out. You know, I looked at the repurposing of the various factories in Easthampton, and I wonder what could be done with something like this if we were to vacate the police department and the fire department buildings, you know. There's many things that have been done in Easthampton, and perhaps we could find somebody who would be also interested in converting some of those buildings for similar use here in Southampton, for artisan studios or whatever. This might be a crazy idea, but it could also bring in some tourism to Southampton. It could also, you know, help us accent the heritage that we have in Southampton and be a tourism opportunity here. The essential thing is that we don't need to let it drift away. We need to decide collectively what we want in town, and be sure that we go for the grant money to make it happen. It's often said if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And I think if we are convinced that infrastructure department investment has a positive impact, we need to have a plan and go after it.
Thank you very much. And so, Charlie, how will you attempt to improve Southampton's infrastructure so that we may welcome businesses that will supplement our residential real estate tax base?
First, the Select Board is going to have to decide as a team what the priorities are as to how to move forward with this. I will throw out some discussion items here relative to this. Take, for instance, sewer lines. Back some 30 years ago, we had a study, and we spent $400,000 studying this town, and all those reports have been put away, but we actually had linkage to the city of Westfield in a number of areas, Hamden Ponds included. Hamden Ponds happens to be a nitrogen loading area. In other words, we really don't want to have sewage getting into the soils there, because it will pollute the drinking water. It may be that if you want to improve the infrastructure, you can go to the federal government through the Department of Agriculture, and they have low interest loans to take and help communities to put in sewer lines, water lines. That linkage might be something to take and build a line down County Road, which would open up that other lands out there for other types of industrial, commercial operations. We also have College Highway on the Westfield border, which has a number of areas that are industrially zoned. But soil conditions being what they are, it would require some type of sewage disposal and water. The water out in that area, because I happen to know the water system in town, the pressure is too low to maintain fire suppression for any large buildings out there. So that inhibits any developer of wanting to bring in smaller businesses or that from doing anything out there, because they don't have that support. It may be time to take and look at linkage into Westfield with that, either that or increasing our water supply here to take and provide services out there. There's a number of homes out there that are actually high in sodium, and their drinking water is to the point where they take bottled water and have for years. It might be a service to the general public to do that. Those are part of the infrastructure stuff that needs to be looked at, aside from talking about East Street, talking about what are we going to do with the fire station, the public safety stuff, and all the rest of that. There's a lot of area here when we talk about improvement to the town, and we can't depend on just a residential tax base for this. We need to look to state and federal grants that may be available to establish things, but we also need to take and look at a way of enhancing, having commercial operations in this town to run businesses that can generate low-impact businesses that don't rely on all the services of the town.
Okay, thank you. We have some time for some audience questions, voter questions.
Is there anybody, I should have said up front, please make sure your questions are addressed to both candidates and not just one candidate, or another candidate, so we just want to make sure that questions that are relevant, that both folks can answer. If you have any more to collect, if you'd like to rephrase your question, maybe make it more, address that, we'll do that. Are you almost done with your question, Barbara?
Yeah.
So many questions, so few answers. Anybody else have a question to submit before we, and if we do, Ray will try to, if there are duplicates, Ray will go through them and make sure that we don't have to see one, ask them twice, even if they're phrased quite differently, a little bit differently. And we have one more coming.
Okay.
So if there's anything that's addressed to just one individual versus another, I would ask you, if you can't phrase it generally, Ray, not to ask the question, okay? We have one more coming.
And the question is,
Better be a good one.
Okay, here we go. We're going to start with Charlie. Do you think there is a more efficient way to structure our health department?
yes, I believe, based on what I'm seeing with our health department, we need to start looking at reorganizing it, and we need to look at the long-term possibility of regionalizing it. I actually am appointed as under a special legislative commission, and my appointment is from the governor under workforce development, and those reports are going to be coming out in the next, we'll say, 6 months. And they basically evaluate over the last 2 years by the state legislators' request how the functionality is of all the health departments in the Commonwealth, and what is a better mechanism not only to operate them but to fund them. That is coming down with workforce development strategies on what credentialing will be, and so on and so forth. And you have to appreciate a town like Southampton with 6,000 people has a diversity of needs. However, it doesn't have the volume of needs that allows you to have the expertise in every field to be available to you. That's why there's a lot of discussion on regionalization.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, do you think there is a more efficient way to structure our health department?
I do. I'm not totally convinced that the staffing that we have now is adequate in terms of its qualifications, but also I really think that there are ways to explore looking at sharing services in the health department and perhaps other services in town that we may have an advantage on that other communities could maybe benefit from as well, or we could borrow from another community rather than having to set up our own. So yes, I do think that there are ways to look at improving services and sharing services for a cost-effective measure for our town that would help us avoid having budget cuts. I talked briefly about having better maximization and cost effectiveness, and I think that would be one way to do it, would be shared services wherever that's appropriate, and it needs to be looked at. There may be some that are just absolutely not possible to do, but it certainly is worth the analysis.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with Chris. How would you determine the next steps in support of our senior population, new senior center, housing, et cetera?
Well, I think the senior center idea and housing are very, very important. The reality of senior housing here in town, I think, as I've mentioned, is a concern to me, because I think there are many seniors in town that just really don't have the opportunity to move to someplace affordable when they have to downsize. And I think that's a shame, and I think we need to do something about it ahead of time. The senior center itself, I think, it has to be another priority that we look at. The senior center here, from what I'm understanding, can hold about 75 people if we're really at maximum capacity. And I haven't been there yet when it's been full, but I hear that sometimes it can be. But with some 2,200 or more seniors in town, that's just not sufficient, and it doesn't even begin to draw out people that might want to attend various programs there. I think the senior center, though, needs to be in a location that's logical. Seniors are less mobile. They may not have vehicles anymore. They need to get close to banking, to shopping, to doctor's appointments. So we need to take a look at where that might be in town, and I would not think that the old town hall would be the best place for that, but rather up toward the existing Cumberland shop area and the elderly housing that's up there, actually. That, to me, would be somewhere in that neighborhood would be more logical in terms of their having closer services that could help them throughout whatever the life they want to spend here. So.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, how would you determine the next steps in support of our senior population with a new center, housing, et cetera?
Well, again, this needs to be a priority set by the Select Board as a team effort to move this forward. I also think that the Select Board should reach out to Pioneer Valley Planning to have a discussion with them to see if there's a program that they have to take and do more analysis for Southampton and maybe look at ways of introducing housing and ways of funding building a senior center. That needs to happen in this town. I actually agree with Chris that if we could move that up closer to the Easthampton Savings Bank area of town, it would be better served where the core population is right now. However, that would take land purchases and that's one of the reasons I'm looking at the old town hall, coupled with the fact that the old town hall is eligible for federal money as well as community preservation money, so that helps soften the blow. But we need to become more active with our seniors on many different levels here. And I'm not saying it because I'm a senior.
Okay,
I'm told
thanks.
that I'm a senior now.
Okay, well, next question, we'll start with Charlie. We have negotiations with 3 bargaining units. What do you feel can be done to ensure our employees are rewarded fairly for their services? And do you feel the employees and their unions treat the town fairly? I think I got that right. Yes.
Well, I haven't been involved in the last union negotiation, so what I'm speaking towards is about 3 years ago. I felt that the discussions at the unions 3 years ago was fair and amicable to the town and to the employees. I do realize that there is an interesting give and take with the unions because of the fact that one union will negotiate from one stance and another union will negotiate from another stance. And then when the negotiations move forward, they discover if the town is moving in one direction with one union, then the other union tries to get those same benefits. But all in all, I think we have a good system. We have good employees in town. I think that the bargaining system is being done in good faith with everyone. I don't see any flaws with this other than the fact that everybody that negotiates always wants the sun and the moon, and we have to bring it back to earth.
Okay, thanks. We have negotiations with 3 bargaining units. What do you feel can be done to ensure our employees are rewarded fairly for their services? And do you feel the employees and their unions treat the town fairly?
Mm-hmm. I will admit that I've not really had any direct experience with the unions here in town. I'm a firm believer in unions, and I'm a firm believer in what the labor movement has done for all of us in this country in terms of our 40-hour work weeks and our other benefits that we've enjoyed over time. From everything I've heard, though, the union negotiations seem to be on a pretty amicable, I guess I would say, basis, that even though there might be points of disagreement, there doesn't seem to be, from what I've heard, too many things that can't be ironed out after discussion. And I think that the basic thing is to treat people fairly. That's what it's all about. I mean, if you've got workers and you've got defined jobs and people know what their job is supposed to be and they've got performance standards to abide by, they've got qualifications that they need for those jobs, then when the time comes, then you need to treat them right and pay them fairly. And I think that's just common sense. And so I would say that the union process, from what I've heard, seems to be working okay in Southampton for our teachers, our police, and our highway department dispatch people.
Okay, thank you. We'll start here with Chris. What issues have voters shared with you, and what skills and experiences do you bring to help address them?
Probably, actually, one of the the big ones I've heard about has been the affordable housing for seniors. That's definitely been one that I've been approached on more than once. And then also people are talking about just taxes. You know, it's very unfortunate that people feel like they can't quite manage with their incomes here in town, and the taxes are a challenge to people. So I think we've got to do something to help people along. My skills in general have been from a community basis, working with communities to find out what some of those problems are, what the root causes of a problem is. Because sometimes, like I say, you can think you know the answer, and you can think you've identified the problem, and you maybe haven't. So, you know, as we talk about elderly situations, what is the housing issue? What is it that people want? What kind of housing would be acceptable to people? How do we do something with our tax base? That, like I've said before, I think is a challenge to us. We could bring in some commercial development, but it's probably going to be more family-based type businesses rather than big storefronts. At the same time, you know, we've got People's that's going to be closing up pretty soon. What are we going to do about that? There's ways to try and be proactive and engage people in town to take care of what's going on around here. And I think for me, you know, working with communities and trying to get people to express their needs and really understand how to participate in the whole democratic process is really important. I've had budgeting skills, contract negotiation skills, a variety of personnel skills that all tie into my past work, and any of those at some point in time will be useful, I'm sure, here in town.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, what issues have voters shared with you, and what skills and experiences do you bring to help address them?
Well, the first one is always the taxes. That seems to be a long-term discussion. Another one has been the open spaces question and trying to understand why there's this sudden movement for the open space. And that's been a long discussion going back and forth. The other one is trying to improve things in Southampton. One of the things that came up was what happened to our greenway and our bike path. Another thing is what's happened with the public safety complex, what's going on there. What's happening in general with the East Street Bridge and that. So I've been getting a lot of comments about a lot of different areas. What I can bring back is the fact that I lived in this town my entire life, as did Chris, but I also have been actively involved in town government for my adult life. And I started off standing by those windows going to school, and those windows were a lot higher back then. But, you know, the point is, I worked for the Commonwealth for over 20 years as the state district health officer, which was a ranking public health official for Western Massachusetts. I oversaw this region as a resource to the communities, cities, and towns relative to public health. That has provided me with the linkage to take and know where the buttons are to push at the State House, some of the federal connections, as well as the locals. Presently, I'm working and supporting about 25 different communities on different areas of public health, which opens the door for me to access their town administrators, their mayors, so on and so forth. So I get input and feedback of stuff I can bring back to Southampton to make this community better.
Okay, thank you. We'll start again here with Charlie. What are your thoughts on establishing a DPW?
That hasn't been discussed for over 5 years. The evolution of time is going to require this. Our water department is expanding, and it's basically outgrowing the highway department garage. Our highway department is doing cemeteries, parks, so on and so forth, which is really creating it to be a multifaceted highway department, which is going to be a DPW. It's just going to be a question of time when the select board decides to pull the trigger on this and readjust the budgets to take and create that.
Okay, Chris, what are your thoughts on establishing a DPW?
No, similarly, I think that's something that, as Charlie has said, that there's a growing need and a growing population and services that are being demanded that we need to figure out how to better coordinate. And sometimes I think we've got people that are shared between each other, each service, that, you know, maybe is not the most effective way to do it with two separate services in two separate directions. We probably do need to think about combining those services for the better cost effectiveness of the town, and improve service delivery. I think that's something that the Select Board ought to take a look at and see what makes the most sense in terms of reorganization of certain boards and departments in town.
Okay, thank you. Chris, we'll start with you here. How familiar are you with our town's published master plan, and what priorities identified in the master plan should the town move forth to enact?
As mentioned, as of a few months ago, I'm an at-large member on the master plan committee, so we have been painstakingly for the last few months going through chapter by chapter by chapter and reading that to figure out what it was intended to do, what the vision was, what the citizens back in 2010-12 thought about in terms of the future of this town. And it's been very enlightening, actually, to learn what was thought about back then. I think, unfortunately, many things have not been able to be enacted for a variety of reasons, but now is the time where the master plan is getting a new life, shall we say. There's a new interest in it, and I think it will provide a good guideline for future development here in town. I think, as I had mentioned, the seniors and the affordable housing is definitely one big one. I would like to take a look at perhaps some energy issues. I mean, I think we are sorely lacking in things like solar energy. I happen to have a solar panel at my house, but I would think that there were ways here to encourage some better energy use from the bills I've heard about in terms of the cost of our utilities here, supporting our public facilities of some $27,000 a year. That seems astronomical to me. But I think there are ways that we can improve on that if we start looking at creative ideas. And we need to start thinking outside the box. You know, we've done things for a certain way for a long time, but maybe we need to start looking at things with a fresh pair of eyes to see what can be done. Mobility, the bike trail has certainly been one that came around probably 20 years ago. And in fact, was not that popular back then. And I will probably guarantee you that my family, as farmers on Gun Road, were probably one of the ones that would not have wanted the bike trail coming very close to our property at the time. But things have changed. There's a different use for bike trails. There's more people using them for a variety of reasons, for public health, their own health, as well as just appreciation of nature. So I think it's time to get off the dime and figure out what we want to do with the bike trail. There's been money out there for it. We've missed the opportunities for it. There's still some agreements in place, I understand, with the railroad to think about getting the access to the railway. We need to start moving that and talk to and lobby our current legislators. My experience in the federal government system with the foundation I was working at has put me in touch with a lot of people, and I'm certainly more than willing to go and knock on doors and talk to legislators from here to the governor and on up to see what we can do. There are definitely funds available for the bike trail program at the federal level, and I think we can figure that out. And if there is still opposition to the bike trail, which there may be, then we need to talk to other communities that have gone through this. Easthampton, Northampton surely had landowners that were not in favor of it. What did they do to solve it? Was it an issue of privacy? Was it an issue of possible vandalism? What were the concerns? And how did they solve it so that they were able to bring those homeowners on board to support the bike trail? We are the missing 2-mile middle, and I think we need to either decide to do it or stop talking about it.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, how familiar are you with our town's published master plan, and what priorities identified in the master plan should the town move forward to enact?
I sat on the original committee that drew up the master plan, so we are talking back 2010 at the end. Everyone has to realize that that is a living document that evolves as the community changes. I would not, at this point, want to sit here and name specific sections as to what we should do, because we've just established a new committee to reevaluate that, to get direction on it. I would listen to those comments and focus on what they are and see what the priorities are relative to the town's need. Like I said, I sat on that for back in 2010. That was a number of years sitting on that to put that together, but it's a living document. One should not pick it up and assume that because something was written 10 years ago, that's the gospel. It does change as the town evolves, and that's the underlying issue with this. So I would rather sit and wait and see what the final reports are with the new committee before actually saying, well, we'll do this or we'll do that, because I don't know what the committee is going to come back with.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, so what is your position on education funding?
Education funding in Southampton should be a priority in our budget. We need to focus on that because that's basically our lifeblood in our community. The reality of it is we have a lot of state mandates that have never been funded. Presently, we are looking at a state budget that my understanding is like $1 billion in the black. The hope is they restructure some of their funding sources for our local schools to work forward, and that's somewhere where a select board, I believe, should take a position to tell the legislators to encourage them to try to get more funding at the local level on that. To try to take and glean it out of an operational budget of a town, simply that is going to fail because we're going to end up cutting other services that we have to have. We need to take and try to get the state to own up to its responsibility. For example, the state promised us when we went regional schools that they would pay for transportation. I don't know what the percentages are now, probably somewhere close to 50% of the busing is reimbursed. That's a lot of money. And that's where we need to voice ourselves as a select board to try to get the state to come back with that money, not try to find some way of finding money in Southampton, because I don't see how that's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. Chris, what is your position on education funding?
I'm a strong supporter of education funding, especially for what I would say is our school in town, i.e. Norris. Having graduated there, like I said, it really prepared me for getting involved in high school activities, which at that time was Easthampton High, not Hampshire Regional. But nonetheless, I think we need to make our budget for the school a priority, and I think we need to make it whole. I sat through a couple of meetings that were just painful to see the nickel and diming that had to go on to pull from one department or another in order to get another $5, another $1,000 here and there for Norris School and the programs that they wanted to put in place this year, namely the language-based learning program that they're hoping to install. I think we have to do that. We've got to really focus on making our schools some of the best learning environment that we can. We've got dedicated teachers. We've got infrastructure that's now going to be repaired. You know, we are a feeder basically to Hampshire Regional and Smith Moak. So whatever we do at this level, we're preparing the kids to then either succeed or not succeed very well in their high school years. And I think we need to not shortchange the schools and not think about things that maybe seem costly right now without understanding that if we do it now, it's going to bring a better situation for us in the long run. Just thinking about the kids that maybe have to go out of town because we don't have the services that are here. The cost of sending children out to other schools like Whitebrook, transport costs, whatever. I've been told that it's some $60,000 a year to send kids out of district. That shouldn't need to happen. We should be wanting to keep the kids here in our town, in our school, and in fact creating the programs so that we can bring others in and perhaps benefit from a little bit of a revenue stream ourselves. So I'm very much in favor of the education budget being a big priority for us. And I know that's a challenge with other departments, but I think it's important, and that extends on to how we have to deal with Hampshire Regional as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm just checking the time. So we'll start this question with you, Chris. Describe your style when working with a group to gain consensus.
Oh, well, that's kind of basically what I've been doing most of my life. I'm not somebody who comes in with the ideas and the answers. I am definitely somebody who sits back and encourages dialogue and participation. Usually, for example, I'll just give you the work that I've been doing in Africa, working with communities to help define a priority project for the community, an income-generating economic development project for the community. Many times I'd go in and people would say all sorts of things that they thought I might want to hear, because after all, I was on the other side of the equation. I was coming with the grant money. Not in my pocket, but I had the power to do that, right? And so part of what my job was to sift through what I call the cobwebs. You know, there's too many ideas, there's a lot of wish lists, but is it really the real need of what anybody wants? And how do you get through all of that to understand that there's a real core problem that you're trying to solve, so that when you do provide grant money, you do assist in technical assistance, whatever it may be, you're actually putting your money to wise use, that it's going to actually solve the problem and not simply bypass it. And I think for me, it's patience, it's persistence, it's certainly a collaborative effort, it's strong communication skills. I sit back and I try to play devil's advocate to be sure that people have really thought through their needs and that they really can have an action plan that will succeed. So I think that's something that I enjoy doing, and would hope that those skills can bring some use here in town as well. Having done community development in Africa, I can't imagine that it can't be translated to community development in Southampton.
Thank you. So Charlie, describe your style when working with a group to gain consensus.
Well, I was a certified manager for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and basically oversaw operations of up to 50 employees at a time. Other than that, I've worked with communities trying to reach the conclusion of necessity relative to risk. What my style has always been has been to present the issue on the table, let the groups all discuss it, listen to the groups, see what comes out of those discussions to try to figure out what seems to be the most positive direction, encourage the group to move towards that positive direction and keep focused on the topic. And once we reach a conclusion that seems to be fair and equitable to everyone, to take and move forward with that. It's a simple style. It's sort of like a book I read in manager class that was training him to reach the cheese, which sounds silly, but the reality is you're trying to make sure everyone reaches the same goal and understands there's a reward at that goal to get to the conclusion they need to do. And that's basically my style.
Okay, let's see. Charlie, how do you feel about tax breaks to bring businesses and industry into town?
I believe short-term tax breaks as an incentive, if it's working with programs relative to the Commonwealth, makes sense, because we have to look at businesses as long-term investments in our community. So if we end up with a couple of years of tax breaks, in the long term, it betters the community.
Chris, how do you feel about tax breaks to bring businesses, industry into town?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think short-term, it's probably okay. I would not necessarily be in favor of long-term tax breaks, but I think there are incentives that are needed to bring in businesses here, as well as to encourage developers to perhaps put in a few extra units of affordable housing. There's got to be ways that we can have a negotiation with people that want to come into town and provide some incentives for them to do business here or to live here or to build houses here. And I think that's the reality. So some sort of tax breaks are probably fine in the short term. I would not oppose that idea.
Okay, we're going to move to wrap up. Closing statements. You'll have a minute to wrap up, and we'll start with you, Chris, to do that.
Okay. Well, minutes go by fast. Okay. I guess I would just say that I'm somebody who has been away for a while, but I came back. I retired 2 years ago and came back to Southampton. And it's something that I kind of always knew that I was going to do, and I'm glad that I'm able to come back and live in my own family house. I'm glad that my parents had the forethought in the early 80s to also put that land in agricultural preservation so that I can look out onto the beautiful area that I have and not look out onto a housing development. My skills, I think, are varied: program management, budget management, negotiation, personnel management, project evaluation, program audits. I've got a lot of experience working with budgets. I managed 20 country offices overseas in Africa from Washington, D.C., and managed a grant budget of about $18 million a year. So I've had experience doing that, and I think those are skills that can translate to Southampton.
Thank you very much. And Charlie, your closing statement.
My closing statement is I have dedicated my entire adult life to work in Southampton on committees and boards to try to make my community, our community, better. I enjoyed my 3 years as selectman. I was in a situation as select board where we lost the town administrator. There were several months where I was actually quasi-playing the town administrator until we were able to hire a new town administrator. I bring with me hands-on working experience of operation of the town and the surrounding towns knowledge, and functionality. I would like to do this again and move it forward.
Thank you very much. So thank both candidates for the Select Board, and thank the audience for your questions. We'll have a break and move into the next forum in a few minutes. Sorry I didn't get through all the questions.
Oh, there were more?
There were a lot of them.
Oh, thank you. I don't think so.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
I'm switching you to the other side now, so don't get comfortable.
Just move, right? Okay, all right. He's just like Kathy. I'm at a concert. They're playing the cello. She's crunching up cellophane. When he did that, I was like, oh my God, we're doing the same thing here. I know. Yes, I go to the other side. It's change again. The other field is playing.
Certain times to return the phone call.
Right.
One brewery only.
Yeah. You got to appreciate the fact, Joe and I have known each other since Christ was a baby. So,
I first met Charlie when he was a busboy at the Last Supper.
it was a while, but you're in real trouble sitting between the two of us.
Yeah.
So if you had the questions for Select Board on the back, you have the questions for the water, and then we'll also will take questions for the water commissioners as well. So
All right,
if you need a card, just raise your hand, and I'll be happy to give you a card for questions for water.
all right. Joe used to give me the key to the pump station, so when there was a fire in town, it was my job to run down to the pump station and turn the pump on. That's how.
Okay. Okay.
Good? On the TV, on the media? Good.
We're good? Okay.
Is this another debate kind of thing?
Yes. For Water Commission.
You're just wrong.
The field changed positions, you
You're gonna
notice
move 'em
that?
back
It's
and forth.
halftime.
I'm getting the other side of Charlie's face.
Yes, yeah.
That way the sun's in his face here and it wasn't there.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the Water Commission Forum. We'll do the same thing. We'll have a 3-minute introduction by each candidate. There'll be a 30-second card, and then a green card, and then a fuchsia card when time is up. And we'll randomly choose from the names. And then once we do that, if you have questions, you can write your questions down during the introductions. And then we'll have some questions already prepared. And then we'll do the audience questions. Okay. So the first person is Joe. You have 3 minutes. Tell us all about yourself. And you're going to need that.
Okay. I've been in this water industry for a little over 62 years. I started in 1957. I started as a water system installer, then turned to well driller, and around 1986, 87, 88, I sold the company, decided to retire. Instead, I came to work for the town of Southampton and became the first full-time water superintendent that was here. under our direction, we went with the previous board and the engineers. We put together roughly 32 miles of brand-new pipeline. We put in a new 800,000-gallon tank up on Walcott Road. We increased the service structure from approximately 350 customers to over 1,400 customers, and introduced a meter program at that time. And I probably left something out, but for the most part, that covers it.
Thanks. Okay, Charlie.
First of all, I have the deepest admiration for Joe. I have known Joe all my life. We've been friends forever. We've worked together on many different projects. I've assisted him with the water department on many different levels. I came from a different flavor, though. My issues have to do with public health relative to public water supply. I was involved with the Department of Environmental Protection in the investigation of the contamination of trichloroethylene down in the Barnes Aquifer, which did serve some of Southampton. Part of the work that I was involved in was to verify where these sources were from, how long expanded they were in the areas, which then encouraged the water department to take and start running water lines throughout the Hamden Ponds area of the town and such to take and serve people for drinking water because their private wells were contaminated. So Joe and I actually have worked for years hand in hand on the public water supply in this community. I would sit on the Barnes Aquifer Committee and look at projects that were being proposed in this whole region, and we would make our recommendations based on what we felt was best for the general public, and we would watch the town of Southampton's water department as it continued to grow, because it had to provide services in many different areas because people's wells had the potential of being contaminated in certain areas. So Joe and I have worked together for years, and I find it kind of interesting that the two of us are on opposite sides here talking about the same seat.
Okay. It's a small town, right?
It's a small town. Well, you know, I'm the emergency manager in Southampton also. We wear many different hats. There's a number of people in town that are core volunteers that help the community and have all their adult lives. Joe's one of them, I'm another.
Great, thanks. So we'll start with you, Charlie, with the first question. What is the most important issue facing the water department in the short term?
I think the short-term issue with the water department is the fact that they need to expand even more as the town grows. More and more services are being expected, in other words, more water supplies. I made a comment earlier about the fact that if you take a look at College Highway over in the Westfield line, the water pressure is too low to support any additional commercial operations and industries. That needs to be addressed. There's a number of homes there that have contaminated wells with salt water, mostly from the state highway, I would suspect. There needs to be some discussion on expanding that also. As the emergency manager, I've been basically helping the water department secure a federal grant for about $700 to $1 million to take and raise the water line that we have that goes under the Manhattan River over by the ice cream stand, Lyman Sheet Metal area, because if that dam was ever removed, that water line would get undermined and it would break. Plus, that water line, and Joe can correct me, is probably 1940 cast iron, which is long overdue to be replaced. When I worked with the taking of property to build the Safe Routes to School over by the Easthampton Savings Bank in that, one of the things we worked in conjunction with was with the water department to replace that water lines out there because they were way outgraded as to what was necessary. So that was another area we worked on. But short term, we need to get all this old plumbing out of here. East Street's another one that needs to be addressed, and that's one of the reasons we need to start using the infrastructure pressure to take and do East Street over, which means take and get those old water lines out of that area too. That's just a short list.
Okay. Joe, what is the most important issue facing the water department in the short term?
On the short term, one of the things that we have to complete, and the plans are already in the works, the water department should have them within the next week or two, is a interconnection between us and the town of Easthampton, which would be located by the hedges up by the Tractor Supply store. The reasoning for that is we have a memorandum of agreement with the town of Easthampton to be able to withdraw approximately 750 gallons a minute, which then would afford us to be able to shut down our Glendale Road well and be able to get in there and redevelop that well. The well right now is producing approximately 515 gallons a minute, but you can see that the drawdown in this well is going deeper and deeper with each passing year, which means that our filtration well screen area is starting to plug, which is a common thing with gravel developed wells. The other part of this would be to see if we could work with DEP and be able to increase our groundwater withdrawal permit, because right now it's at 0.79 million gallons per day. All right, so that being said, we were looking to see if we could put another well in there for redundancy to back up this well. The other part is we have the Pequot well field, which was developed back in the early 60s, I think. And while that is in the TC area that Charlie was talking about, DEP had the water department go down there, and there's several 2.5-inch test wells. And we tied into one of them 2.5-inch test wells and did some extensive pumping, and we did not come up with any traces of the TCE contamination, and that would be another thing to look at and for the short term.
Okay, thank you. So what is the most important issue facing the water department in the long term, Joe? Start with you.
One of the long-term projections would be to increase our storage capacity, our 790-something thousand gallon tank up on Walcott Road. We have 3 possible locations in mind. One would be on East Street, behind the apple orchard up on that hill, College Highway, and White Loaf Road. Then the next most important thing in the long term would be to replace the water main from Pomeroy Meadow Road and College Highway all the way to Brickyard Road. That water main needs to be replaced. That's all old pit cast iron. The next thing would be to complete a loop from Whispering Meadow to County Road, because the feed line that goes into the whole ponds area is one 8-inch line. We have no backup other than an interconnection with the town of Easthampton. The 8-inch line starts at the Big Y and ends at the Westfield line on County Road, and that's the only feed line that we have into that area. And it's vitally important that system, at some point in time, gets all tied together. And and then we are now getting into year 12, 13 of the meter installation original, we're going to have to start looking at some point in time, upgrading the meter system again. The one poor thing is we put all the meters in at the same time, and we're hoping that they don't all start to fail at the same time. But, you know, it's an ever-going thing, and then constantly looking at our rate structure.
Thank you. Charlie, what is the most important issue facing the water department in the long term?
Everything Joe said, I agree with, but the other part to this is the fact that we need to start looking at the fact that our water department's evolving into a large department, and we need to look at housing situations, clerical support, and all the rest of that goes with it. That's where that circles back to that whole DPW issue. So, yeah, Joe's talking about the infrastructure and the operations and everything else. I actually don't have any debate with that whatsoever. But we also have to look at it from a management point of view, that we need to start expanding that infrastructure to start accommodating that also.
Okay. Do you feel the enterprise fund model is an effective mechanism to manage the operating budget, and why? And we'll start with you, Charlie.
I believe at this point in time, that is the approach that needs to be maintained. The water users need to basically fund the program and keep it going, because there's other people that are on private well. Myself, I have property that is on well, and I have properties that are on town water. But I believe that if you're getting a service from the town and you're specifically the only one getting that service, you should be paying for that service. So yeah, I think that we should maintain the enterprise account. Now, that may change and skew a little bit as time goes on, but at least for the short term, that there shouldn't be any change.
Okay. Joe, do you feel the enterprise fund model is an effective mechanism to manage the operating budget, and why?
Absolutely. The enterprise fund allows the system to be somewhat independent, but even though we still have to abide by all the rules and regulations of how the money is dispersed back out. We just can't arbitrarily say, wow, we got a surplus over here, we need to expand this, just go out and do it. We can't. We have to go through the due process of town, and the voters have to vote as to how these retained earnings will be dispersed. So it's the greatest thing going.
Okay. So Joe, what is your understanding of the Mass DEP rules and regulations which govern the operation of the water system?
Mass DEP, I think, is a very, very good, conscientious bunch of people. There are some times when you think that they're the bad guy, but they really ain't if you sit back and analyze and look at the rules. I'm somewhat familiar with like the coliform rule and the lead and copper and all the rest of them. I would just have to sit back and reread them all. I think probably some of the changes in the coliform rule are collection points, the increase in collection points. But other than that, I get along real good with the DEP, and they're very, very good people. And the one thing you want to remember with DEP, if something you don't understand, talk to them first, and things go one lot smoother.
What is your understanding of the Mass DEP rules and regulations which govern the operation of the water system?
I have been working hands-on with the Department of Environmental Protection in my professional capacity for over 20 years in the Department of Public Health. That meant that I was notified whenever a city or town had boil orders or contamination issues, and how to respond and work with them. I've always had an upfront, open door relationship with the Director of DEP as well as the Division Director for the Public Water Supply Division. I'm pretty versed in the public water supply regulations of the Commonwealth and have a working relationship with them. One has to appreciate where I was in a regulatory position, Joe was in a hands-on position, but the two of us still came to the same center point to work on these things.
Okay, this is going quickly.
Are we done, Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so.
I have one more. What experience will you bring to the Water Commission?
For me?
Yeah.
I will bring the experience of working with the state agencies and being able to provide that linkage with the Water Commission. I also have the lifelong experience of being in town and helping with the Water Department. If you want a pun, when they were taking and putting in the pumping system on Gilbert Road, they called me at the farm to come down to help them put the electric boxes in because they needed another set of hands. When I was on the fire department and there was a major fire, I was the one that would grab the keys and run down to the, what do you call it, pumping station and turn the pump on so that we had more pressure in the water system, always being reminded by Joe not to blow the well head out of the well. So I bring a lot of experience here relative to that operation of that facility.
Okay. And Joe, what experience will you bring to the Water Commission?
Well, I was a superintendent for one long time. I hold a grade 2 water distribution license and a grade 1 combination treatment license. Well, I would not use any of that stuff as being a commissioner because we have a full-time superintendent and a full-time technician. And I'm very familiar with a lot of the rules and regulations. I know where a lot of the skeletons are buried. And
We both do, Joe. We both do.
so it's been my life, water. That's, I don't have a big, long, nice story like Charlie had.
I had to flower it up a little bit, you know?
Is there any audience questions?
I have a couple. Does anybody else have anything to submit? Excuse me.
So we'll start with you, Joe. Should the Water Department have a decision-making role in the creation or building of new housing developments?
Yes. The plans are generally submitted to us through the superintendent of the highway department, and we do a comprehensive review on how the water lines are to be put in, the placement of the hydrants, where the services are, and what the fees will be in order for them to tie into the existing system, and what the fees will be to tie in each individual lot. And that's where our position ends. What we like to see is on these subdivisions that we don't get a lot of dead-end lines. And we try to avoid that at all costs.
Okay, should the Water Department have a decision-making role in the creation or building of new housing developments?
Yes, and they do, simply because of the fact that if we're providing a service, they have to do an evaluation on that, and everything that Joe said is absolutely, I agree with. And if you were to take a look at the general laws relative to planning and stuff, you'll see that they have to be an active participant in any subdivision that's submitted.
Okay. They're not using up their 3 minutes, so. At times when other neighboring communities had mandatory water restriction, we had only volunteer. Would you be willing to change that?
That is a case-by-case basis. There's no way to predict right now. It's like the Quabbin Reservoir spillway. is at 110% capacity right now. 5 years from now, it could be a barren wasteland. There's no way somebody's going to sit here and make a decision as to what's going to occur down the road. Not with that. It's too changeable.
Okay. Times when other neighboring communities had mandatory water restriction, we only had volunteer. Would you be willing to change that?
No, I agree with exactly what Charlie says, and I don't think I can elaborate on that at all.
Okay.
Do I get credit for all these minutes we're saving?
Yeah. These are extra points at the other end of the game.
Okay. I think it's going to take me longer to read the question than it will to answer it. So we'll start again with you, Joe. This is the last one we have. What correlation exists between new growth of housing and water supply for the town? Should we cap the number of homes that hook into the supply of water?
With the advent of this new pumping station, we will be really hard pressed to put any type of, basically what you're looking for is a moratorium. And we would be hard pressed to do it because now we would have available over 1,300 and something gallons a minute that we could produce. So it's a hard shot, and it could only be looked at on a case-by-case basis. It's kind of a broad question, but that's the way I would have to address it. I mean, if it was a 200 or 300 house subdivision,
That would be different, yeah.
that would make the difference. But most of the subdivisions that we're seeing coming into town, I think the last biggest subdivision to hit Southampton was Caitlin, Kevin, and Brittany. And that was, I think, 39 houses went in there. But for the most part, the subdivisions have been 10, 12 at the most. So it would have to be done on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. So what correlation exists between new growth of housing and water supply for the town? And should we cap the number of homes that hook into the supply of water?
I agree with Joe. Given the amount of water we have, we are basically water rich at this point. If you were looking at new growth and you did the basic calculation of DEP and said it's 400 gallons a day per house, we're way beyond that. There would be no, quote, legal way of doing that kind of a moratorium with the water department. So, yeah, what Joe's saying, I totally agree with him. There's nothing there to talk about.
Okay. Was there another written question?
I didn't write it, but can I ask? It's really easy.
If it's for both candidates, right?
Yeah.
That's to you, Ray.
Well, just to Ray, yeah. Question, are private wells prohibited in the town of Southampton?
Not
Can
that
you repeat that for the microphone, please?
Are private wells prohibited in the town of Southampton?
That is not, if I may, Joe, that is not a water department question. That is a question to your local Board of Health as to what their well regulations actually say. Typically, what you will see in a Board of Health regulation is that if they have the capability of tying into town water, they're required to tie into town water. But I don't know verbatim what the town regulation in this, actually says. But it's not the water department's call, it's the Board of Health's call.
Did you have anything else to add to that?
Nope.
I just want to make sure we're giving equal time.
No, nothing. I mean, it's what Charlie said. It's a Board of Health issue. We have picked up several customers down in the ponds area where they have small lots and they've had a septic failure and the Board of Health has forced them to abandon their shallow well and tie into our water system. And that's the only thing that I know of.
Yeah, but that's the Board of Health.
That's,
not the water.
again, it's back to the Board of Health, right? So,
Thank you.
Okay, so if you have something to close with, you have a minute, and we'll start with you, Charlie.
I have always been active in town government, and this is an area that I've never served in, and I was interested in serving in it. And I support that to try to move the town forward with that, and I've become involved with the water department right now as the emergency manager to try to get them funding for a new water line on Route 10 over by Former and Brickyard Road. So, yeah, I've always had a vested interest in the town.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
Joe, fact of the matter that I'm so familiar with the system, all of its little idiosyncrasies, and the lifetime experience is about all that I can offer. And I'm only about 7 years younger than what the system is, so. That's, we're both growing old together.
Yeah.
So that's basically that in a nutshell.
Well, thanks very much to both of you. This was fun. Wasn't it? I'm glad I don't live here now because I don't want to have to choose. So thanks very much for coming. Thank you everyone at home for watching. And don't forget to vote May 21st. Have a good night.
Thank you.